All right. So, another distinction that I want to make before we continue talking about groups is between two terms that are frustratingly similar, but hopefully you're familiar with the the prefixes rather, to these words, intra and inter. I know it can be a little confusing, but they do have very different meanings. Intra meaning within, inter meaning between. So intra-group processes, for our purposes, are the behavioral and psychological dynamics within a particular social group, like within your family or friend group or your office or whatever it happens to be. The process is inside and defining those social groups. Intergroup processes are behavioral and psychological dynamics between different social groups, or oftentimes people still define these as between individuals from different groups. So a person from one religion interacting with a person from another religion, in some senses, is emblematic of how those groups interact with one another. It's dangerous to, assume that everyone in other groups obviously is the same, but that sometimes is the knowledge that we bring to the table when we're interacting with someone from another group. That might be all the information that we have. It's very important not to overgeneralize to people, but sometimes that is the way that we perceive those types of situations. So remember, intra-group processes within a particular group, inter-group processes between groups or between people from different groups. So a couple of things about groups in general before I move on to talk about some intra-group processes. Within a particular group, it's important to think about all these different things. Most groups have these things to some degree or another, that there are roles within a group. It's not just that everybody is some undifferentiated person within a group. Usually there are leaders and there are people with particularly prescribed social roles. Like in a family, there tend to be parents and siblings, and within those siblings, older ones and younger ones that have different levels of responsibility. So those roles are defined within that group. Same thing goes for classrooms and work groups and school projects and things like that. There are roles that, whether they're formal or not, they kind of develop from that group setting. Kind of related to roles frequently is the status differential between people in the group. Most groups have some kind of hierarchy. Even groups that kind of explicitly reject the notion of a hierarchy tend to have some sort of hierarchy, because it's very difficult for groups to not just develop one in some sense. Like, it's very difficult for people not to look to an authority figure for decisions about how a group is supposed to function. So oftentimes there is a status difference in how decisions are made, how resources are allocated, and how much power is concentrated within different parts of a group. Still related to norms and status and roles, are norms within a group. Most groups have, whether they're codified in terms of like laws or code of conduct or something, or they're just informal things that people understand and communicate to one another in some kind of socialization. Norms are rules about behaviors and the values that a different group has and the beliefs that are around them. So norms within, let's say, a work group might be very well defined at the beginning, where people are deciding what parts they're going to do, and norms within a society often are very formal in the sense that they're a literal code of laws. But other norms might be less well defined. Like, political parties formalize their values into platforms frequently that say something about what they should be valuing and believing. But there are also other maybe implicit things that are not codified into those platforms. Like, for example, a Republican platform doesn't necessarily explicitly say we are going to be skeptical of science and skeptical of climate change, but there is a norm among Republicans that is still something that is to be believed, or at least to be represented in some way. So norms may be at different levels of formality for different types of groups. Groups all to some extent have some level of cohesiveness. There's something that's binding them together, whether it's the thing that they bond over, a goal that they share, identity that they share. There's something that keep group members together. And for smaller, more proximate groups, this might be, shared genetics, or it might be, some sort of immediate goal. But for bigger groups, like, residents of Louisiana, or Saints fans, or Americans, it might be something more diffuse, like an identity and similarity that leads you to like people. So there are varying levels of this that, can't go into a million examples, but you can imagine them for the groups that you belong to pretty easily. Okay, so for intra-group decisions, I want to talk a little bit about some different processes. Groups are an incredible thing that they can cooperate and come to agreements about things and accomplish things that people cannot do frequently on their own. But groups also make some pretty bad decisions frequently, and there are a few different reasons that might happen. Part of it is that group decisions tend to require consensus from people. So there's usually a pressure for a group to all agree on a particular solution so they can decide on it and go forward with it. And sometimes this consensus leads to people not wanting to rock the boat, basically. So if people are all just trying to reach consensus so they can move on with something and make a decision and not have controversy, well, that leads to a lower ability for people to be critical about what's going on in those groups. Because, let's say you're a member of a 5-person group and the first 4 people agree on something and you think it is terribly wrong and not the right way to go. You might not speak up, right? And other people might not even think of alternatives. So this push for consensus really does undermine the decision-making capabilities of many groups. One of the ways that this happens is by a term that you're probably familiar with and is studied pretty heavily in both psychology and sociology, is groupthink. This tendency that groups will kind of seize on one idea and then not think about it very much more. So some characteristics of this groupthink dynamic are kind of this consensus, this pressure towards all agreeing on one opinion, being closed-minded to people that disagree with that opinion that's kind of the dominant idea, and the fact that we all, like to think that we are good people and we're smart and the groups we belong to are good and smart too, and assuming that the group would not have come to a decision if it were not a good one already. So all these things, pressure toward consensus, people not wanting to rock the boat, and thinking that your group is capable and smart, can all lead to groups settling on suboptimal types of decisions. So let's think about all of these a little bit in turn. There is a pressure towards this consensus in groups, and sometimes this manifests in people actually being pressured to just go with the flow and not make things more complicated for groups. And something that kind of happens within groups are that some people within them, whether they're the people that came up with the idea or people that are just trying to maintain the integrity of the group by not letting people disagree, or people might think of themselves as mind guards, which sounds like some weird fantasy character subtype or something, but it is a psychological term that it's people that are trying to shield the group from dissent and shoot down alternative ideas in the interest of just maintaining that consensus. So this happens explicitly when people are putting up ideas. Some people might shoot them down or block them, and people are aware of these dynamics and might not want to put themselves out there, especially if they are a lower status member of a group. They might not be comfortable dissenting or putting forth an alternative explanation for something. So people might just not say anything because they don't want to rock the boat. So this pressure towards unanimity in general leads people to, not listen to new ideas, or they just are not shared at all. Overestimation of the group, another one that, we really tend to have blinders on with respect to how capable and intelligent our groups are. And this happens, we overestimate how capable our very close groups are, like, the above average effect, contributing to things like thinking our family is more capable than they are, our friends are smarter and better than they are, really. And it extends to, bigger groups too, like our political parties and our nations, just assuming that, I'm a member of this group, I'm good, my group's good, we're going to be right and everything's going to be fine. That unfortunately is not always true, and it's not always the case that your group's decision-making strategy is the best and only one true way to do something. And we all, like to think that we are moral people that are, doing things in the right way, but, to be real dark about it, that saying that, the villains are the heroes of their own stories, like nobody thinks they're a villain. Some people are, less good, or everybody might have bad intentions at different times, but everybody thinks that they have some type of coherent morality. No one thinks they're the bad person. So it is the case sometimes that people's decisions might not have everyone's best interests at heart, even though they think that there's some sort of moral high ground for them to stand on. And I mean, I've already talked about this a little bit, but, we tend to think that we are generally smart, and the groups we belong to are smart. So our groups, naturally, of course, my group, we're going to deliberate, we're going to come to a good decision. Well, maybe not. If there's strong norms about coherence and cohesiveness and your group doesn't want to rock the boat, you're probably not going to come to a good decision, and just assuming that is one of the things that keeps you from doing so. So all these things together lead you to think that your group's ideas might be better than they are just because your group came up with them. This idea of closed-mindedness, finally, also comes into play when you assume that people in your group are the ones that are coming up with good ideas, and when other people or people outside of your group come up with suggestions, you're downplaying them or denigrating them in a way that disregards them or doesn't fully consider them. These things can lead to just seizing on the first idea or an early idea your group comes up with and not considering alternative ideas because they didn't come from the top down or from within your group. So all these things in general lead to bad decisions that if groups are overestimating their abilities, they're not looking for alternative ideas, they are shooting down dissent within them, well then you're not thinking very carefully about all the alternatives when you're making a decision. So you're not going to think that carefully, you're not going to look for new information, you're going to be engaging in things like confirmation bias by assuming that things that support your ideas are right and things that don't support your ideas are wrong. You're not going to think about other possibilities. This confirmation bias fits in here too, that you're not going to think about the risks of your plan generally, and you're not going to think about alternatives because you assume that your plan is not going to fail. So all of these things lead to bad decisions. One really famous example and well-studied example of groupthink tends to be the Challenger space shuttle explosion that happened in 1986, I believe. That it was, if you're not familiar with it, it was just what it sounds like. There was a shuttle launch. And, the United States had lots of successful space shuttle launches at that time. And this space shuttle took off. It started, the launch did not look right at the time. There was some sort of leakage that you could see as it was taking off, or as it got a little bit into the upper atmosphere. And then the rocket booster exploded, killing everybody aboard. And this was studied because it was identified later that what happened was like this little O-ring, this little like gasket in the space shuttle that was controlling the distribution of fuel was not fit quite properly. It was not machined quite right. And what happened was that this was recognized in internal NASA and Jet Propulsion Lab, I believe, documents before, and they had kind of convinced themselves that it wasn't a problem, that they didn't come up with alternative plans. They assumed it was going to be okay. They, took every piece of information that said it would be all right, and went with it and disregarded things that said it wouldn't. And they, didn't think about how the hierarchy in their group might lead to, pressure for people at the bottom to be kind of silenced, and deference for people at the top. So, people died because of this, and it kind of set back the space program too. So groupthink is a really kind of pervasive thing that especially happens when there is a lot going on, like a lot of the things that defined the circumstances around the Challenger explosion. That group cohesiveness is high. You really feel like you're a member of this group. Like, I'm a NASA scientist or NASA engineer that has this important job, and that is a group that tends to be pretty insular and isolated, right? That you're not getting a lot of outside opinions, and you are not taking alternative options from other people very often. You're just, in a group that tells each other frequently what they want to hear. There is a leader in those situations, and there certainly were managers that knew about these things and kind of disregarded them, and were able to kind of suppress people below them that thought there was a bigger problem. And it was high stress because there was supposed to be a launch, and if that launch didn't happen at the particular time it was scheduled, they would have had to wait months to do it again. So they wanted to believe that it was okay to launch the shuttle, and it wasn't. So all these things like define that circumstance, and you can think of other examples maybe from your life too, but you can undermine groupthink. You can help these things not impact decision making. One way is to make it an explicit goal of your group that you want to make good decisions, not just to make a decision in general and stick with it. You can come up with a systematic way to make those decisions beforehand. So not just saying like, all right, what do we think? Coming up with an actual way instead of just letting people voice a couple ideas. Make a list of pros and cons of all of the ideas. Get opinions from people outside of the group. Make sure everyone shares their opinion. All these types of things might be helpful to have a very specific, deliberative way of processing information. Eliciting views from outside of your group is very important. People that don't have a skin in the game, people that don't have an outcome on them necessarily, might be more neutral and objective about sharing their information. And having, separating a leader from the decision-making process can be really helpful, whether they are impartial and it does not reflect on them, maybe having subgroups that don't report directly to the same leader, and having, some sort of anonymous decision-making or suggestion process so people don't feel like they're going to anger a leader or be put in their bad side or something. So groupthink, it's not inevitable. It is a tendency that we have, but it's something that we do know a lot about how to fight it. And when you do these things, you can make much better decisions. One other kind of poor group decision-making process I want to mention is group polarization, which is something that, obviously we see reflected in the current political situation in the last few decades, getting more and more extreme all the time. But group polarization tends to happen because of some things that we have already talked about. People tend to make more extreme decisions in groups than they would on their own, because we're often unsure of ourselves and we're looking to others for what to think. And we are often making social comparisons about the types of things that are acceptable. And because of these two things, you might tend to be pushed more towards the margins. For example, think about Democrats and Republicans. When you think about Democrats and Republicans, you don't tend to think about like centrist or moderate ones, right? You tend to think about the more extreme ones. So those people are the ones that are kind of setting the norms. And when the more extreme people are setting the norms, then things kind of just get pulled more and more extreme. Or when you have two groups, like Democrats and Republicans, the easiest way to seem like a group member is to differentiate yourself from the other group. So to seem further from a Democrat is to seem more Republican. So things drift further and further apart in those ways. Okay, I guess that's kind of all I want to say about group polarization. I think this is really important and has a lot to do with the current political climate, but I won't belabor this one. Okay, I am going to stop there and kind of prompt you in the next lecture to do a Canvas activity, so I'll be right back with that.